Grappling with Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making. Help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I would like to welcome my guest for today. With me is Jennifer Elder, who is a CPA and a certified speaking professional who helps leaders future-proof their businesses by making smart decisions and staying ethical. Mark O'Brien is founder and principal of O'Brien Communications Group, a B2B brand management and marketing communications firm, and host of The Anxious Voyage, a syndicated radio show about life's trials and triumphs. And Stewart Wiggins is chief advisor at Induna Advisors, working to significantly increase company revenue by developing positive client reports and establishing solid business relationships. Thank you all for being with me today.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
And here is our topic. In the infamous 1857 Dred Scott case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 7-2 that a slave could not sue for freedom because slaves were not citizens, but essentially property. Under the law, this was an entirely defensible position. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney personally opposed slavery. He even freed slaves he inherited himself. But he also believed that the law was clear, and that as a justice of the court, he had a legal and moral obligation to interpret the law as it was written, regardless of whether he agreed with it or not. Legal historians have largely cast the decision as villainous. But is it not a recipe for anarchy when government officers act according to their conscience rather than according to the law? In 2015, a Kentucky county clerk refused to issue same-sex marriage license, claiming that it violated her religious values. In 2017, Acting Attorney General Sally Yates refused to defend an executive order imposing a temporary ban on refugees from countries connected with terrorist activity. Some legal authorities argued that Ms. Yates did not provide adequate justification for her refusal, failing to demonstrate or even claim that the order was unconstitutional. Not surprisingly, the same conservatives who applauded the Kentucky clerk for her act of conscience castigated Ms. Yates for hers, and the same liberals who cheered on Ms. Yates were outraged by the Kentucky clerk's contempt for the law. And for years, metropolitan mayors around the country have established sanctuary cities that refuse to enforce federal immigration laws. We acknowledge the legitimacy of exempting conscientious objectors from fighting in war. Are public servants entitled to the same consideration? If so, how do we ensure that acting according to conscience does not contribute to a total breakdown of the rule of law? A lot to talk about.
Wow.
Who'd like to dive in first?
I just want to say one of my initial temptations in situations like this is to say, well, we're trying to impose contemporary points of view on historical sets of circumstances. However, it turns out that part of the reason that the Dred Scott decision is considered to be so reprehensible is, there wasn't anything that I did read about this that used the phrase judicial overreach. But it could be argued that Taney was guilty of that because in among other things, he completely overrode the Missouri Compromise. He completely overrode the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And it seems to me that he completely overlooked the constitutional notion of states' rights in arguing what he did. So that inclination to think, well, maybe contemporary thinking is being imposed on historical events didn't hold water for me at all. And in response to your last point, I have no idea how or where conscience might have figured into that, considering what Taney apparently thought his job was.
So how do you see it as a states' rights issue? The fact that when Dred Scott got to a free state, he wasn't treated as free? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. He was taken to a free state, then he was taken to what was considered to be a free territory. And Taney just overrode all of that.
But if you steal my property and you take it to some other place where, for whatever reason, the laws are different, shouldn't I have claim on my property?
I'm going to have to say I don't know, because there were states even at that point that were granting slaves citizenship. So, unless the law extended to saying that recognized citizens of any particular state are still property, I'm not sure about that. Sticky.
Yes.
Mhm.
Which is why we're here.
That is why we're here.
There's a lot of, so many ways to unpack this. Couple of things that came to mind to me are the fact that the law is still subject to interpretation. If it was purely black and white, we wouldn't have tiers of court systems. You wouldn't be able to appeal a case and then appeal the appeal, or finally take it to the Supreme Court. There are different ways of looking at the law. And the second thought that came up is what I like to call things being lawful but awful. That something can be legally correct but morally wrong. We saw that.
Jim Crow's a perfect example of that, right?
Yes. And a more recent example might be during COVID, with companies applying for PPP loans. Companies like the LA Lakers.
Yeah.
Why? The intent of the PPP funds was to provide organizations with money to help them get through the pandemic if they did not have access to other sources of cash. Ruth Chris, AutoNation, and LA Lakers all got millions of dollars. Tom Brady, the ex-quarterback, got $1 million. That was pocket change for him.
At most.
Was it legal? Yes. Was it the intent of the law? Was it morally okay? Not so much. And then the organizations like LA Lakers, Ruth Chris, and AutoNation also, they backpedaled when it all came to light and gave the money back. And you could also say, was it not also lawful but awful to disclose the funding that they got? Because nowhere on the application for PPP money did it say, by the way, this is subject to the Freedom of Information Act. This will become public knowledge. So, it's tough to think things through because there isn't that easy black and white. And we put laws in place to the best of our ability, but can't always foresee every application. And if we allow the example of the clerk, if we allow one person to say, I want to exempt myself from one law, does that not allow everybody to exempt themselves from one law that they don't agree with?
Yeah, exactly. And you remind me of the 2008 bailout, car companies in particular, and the government gave them, extraordinary amount of money. I think it was hundreds of billions of dollars to shore up their, it's hundreds of millions, I don't remember, but to shore up their industry and to stimulate the economy, and many of them just sat on it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some blame that goes on the lawmakers that don't have the foresight to design these laws the way they should. But as you say, Jennifer, you can never account for everything. So there has to be a certain will to intuit and uphold the spirit of the law as well as the letter?
Well, there's two parts to every law. And what I mean by two parts is you have the legislative part. And as Jennifer indicated, a group of people get into a room and they debate it and they come up with a law, but they can't consider every single aspect of it. But at the end of the day, that law is just some words on a paper. There's two parts that really make that law work. Our individual adherence to the law, if we decide to do it, and if we don't decide to do it, then who's going to enforce it, i.e. the police or whoever else? I mean, we even have cases now as recently as the past year that members of Congress have been called to testify and they've been brought up on contempt charges and nothing has happened to them. And I'm not going to mention any names, but if you follow the news, you know what I'm talking about. So when we look at these different cases, all these are is just a set of rules. The rules only work if we decide to follow them. It's as simple as driving 55 miles per hour in a 55 mile per hour zone. If you decide to go 70 and the police don't catch you, then you've made a conscious decision that you're going to break that law. So what it really comes down to is what your moral standard is. And, some of you have been on with me before, and I've talked about my military experience. And, what makes the military work is the ability to do the right thing at the right time. And you have the ability to say, I'm not going to follow an illegal order. And the illegal order that comes to my mind, and then I'll stop, is those of you that remember Lieutenant Calley from 1968. And he was in Vietnam, and he and his platoon killed a bunch of Vietnamese. And the argument was, well, he made the argument to kill these people because there was a threat. But there are those that argued, well, maybe he didn't have the right to make that order and they shouldn't have followed that order. So as we talk about laws and following the law, the only thing that makes it work is our moral compass, and then whatever's part of the law to enforce it if we don't use morality.
And then when you raise the military, Stewart, this is something that I think is really compelling. That especially if it's in the moment of war, if a soldier does not do his duty as he's commanded, he could be subject to execution on the spot as a deserter. So on the one hand, he may be doing something that is supremely ethical and moral, and at the same time, he's putting his own life in danger because the rules of engagement don't acknowledge his right to do that. So it gets into a really thorny type of issue. I have a note from Hope here. She says that laws in place for when written as seeing into the future, and those unknown foreseen applications exist. Are those loopholes or opportunities to adapt the original law?
Ooh, that's a good question as well. We often see those sorts of loopholes written in to law, tax code in particular. Is that in every new tax code that comes out, there's some part of the law that says if this type of transaction happened between this date and finished before this date, then it has some sort of tax benefit. And the dates are so specific that it wouldn't apply to but one transaction. And you can say it's law, but the law was written with the intent of assisting someone in particular. And in a lot of cases, when we have new laws come out, in some cases they are to prevent harm, but sometimes they are to help certain organizations or certain groups. And, you know, in the beginning, Jonathan, you mentioned sanctuary cities. You could do days talking about that over, you know, the intent and so many different ethical aspects of that. And then going back to what Mark said over states' rights. Should a state be able to override what the federal government says? We're also facing that with the laws regarding cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
Legal at state level in many cases, but illegal at the federal level. So we now have businesses operating that technically could be raided and shut down.
You know what? While I'm listening and I'm thinking about some of the things that Stewart said and listening to what you were just saying now, Jennifer, I can't help but think of Orwell's notion that some animals are more equal than others. And, you know, Stewart's example was that there are some people in Congress who have been at least cited for contempt with zero consequences. You know, Jonas, and you said something about the government bailout of the auto industry. I think it's just as justifiable to say that was also done to curry political favor, and to keep unions leaning one way politically. It's just it's just so dicey. But I still remain really curious about the notion of states' rights. And Jennifer, I can understand. You know, Connecticut is one of those states that's fairly recently legalized recreational marijuana. If nobody asked me my opinion, but I would tell you that that's nuts, and you know, it's not going to lead anywhere good. But you will face charges if you're a resident of Connecticut that takes that legally acquired marijuana into another state. And I would argue it's not the federal government's business to decide if that's right or wrong. I think it's the state's business to decide if that's right or wrong. I also I've been struggling with Stewart's notion of moral compass, because whether anybody agrees or not, I don't know. But I take morality to be something like a cultural consensus. So some cultural group is going to believe some things are right, and another cultural group is going to think those things are exactly wrong. And maybe, Jonason, ethics comes in when, you know, anybody with particular abilities of discernment might recognize that cultural consensus that constitutes morality for a particular group is ill-founded, misguided. And, you know, one of the examples that always occurs to me is Japanese kamikaze pilots. I mean, in their estimation, those guys were just moral as all get out. In a lot of other places, not so much. So it's just dicey.
Seem to be getting deeper and deeper into the weeds here. Let
Yeah.
me pose this as a hypothetical. The case of the Kentucky clerk. It violated her religious principles to be party to issuing a gay marriage license. I could find myself in a similar situation because I come from a system that is invested in biblical values as they are written. So if I came to my friends, Stewart, Jennifer, and Mark, and asked you, I have a job that requires me to issue a license, and my belief system does not allow me to do that, how would you advise me?
What's the strength of your belief? That would be my question.
Is that the only factor?
Maybe for me, yeah.
You know, it can be more black and white though. And what it really boils down to is you could say that this is how I feel morally, but it really boils down to is, what about your job? This is what we're all humans. Do you want to keep your job? If you don't give the license to these folks or do whatever you're supposed to do, will you lose your job? How important is that to you? So if you can honestly say to yourself, well, my beliefs are so strong that I'm going to risk my job and I'm not going to do it, then that's one thing. But, you know, when we go back to the Dred Scott case, I mean, if you believe what we hear about the Chief Justice and he let all his slaves go, but he had to follow the law at the time, you know, then we could say then that, Jonathan, you're going to have to issue the license or you're going to lose your job. I mean, because to me anyway, that's what motivates some people. If I lose my job, how am I going to take care of my family? And if you can get beyond that point, then your morality can be part of the decision-making cycle. But until you decide if you're in a job that requires you to make those kind of decisions on a day-to-day basis, it's tough. I mean, if you're an attorney, you're used to arguing both sides of any decision. You're trained to do that. But most of us, we go to work on a daily basis and we have a job, and it's either you follow the rules or you lose the job. And I didn't answer your question, Jonathan. I didn't advise you correctly, but the only thing I could say is you either keep your job and you do what you're told, or you risk losing your job and follow your morality. That doesn't answer your question, but that's the facts of the day.
Is your thinking any different, Stewart, if Jonathan has the latitude to leave his job? If it contradicts his beliefs, religious or otherwise, is it different if he has the liberty to leave his job?
I don't see it as any different. I mean, listen, I think he should be able to follow his beliefs. Me personally, I think he should be able to follow his beliefs because we all make decisions on a day-to-day basis, you know. I mean, that we follow our beliefs. But here he is in the role of a county clerk in Kentucky someplace. And on the food chain, there might not be anybody that's much lower in terms of status, not to diminish the role, but it is what it is. There's not much latitude. There's not much flexibility for that person in that role. Now, if you're the county executive, you might have a little more flexibility. If you're the president of the United States, you've got a lot more flexibility. So executives of big companies, they have a lot more flexibility with their ability to stretch the rules more so than a person who is on the lower level of the organization. I know I didn't answer your question, your question, Mark, but I mean, it's a tough question. It's a good question.
No, I think you did. And maybe we're getting far afield again. I don't know. But, you know, in a contemplation like Jonathan's, if he were inclined to seek advice, it seems to me he would be compelled to seek that advice out of some degree of fear. So it seems to me that if you're in fear of losing your job, as opposed to if my job contradicts my beliefs, I can leave it, that feels a little different to me. To acknowledge your point, Stewart, and I don't know where county clerk falls on the totem pole, but you know, if your prospects in such a position are few to get another position, well, that's mitigation to be sure, but
that's actually something to come around to. But Jennifer, you haven't chimed in yet, but what if I framed it this way? Is it morally or ethically defensible for me to say that when I am in the position of my job, that I have accepted the duties that go along with that job, even if they contradict my own personal beliefs? And therefore, I can justify acting in a way that is not consistent with I believe, because it's not really me, Jonason, who's doing it. It's me, the county clerk, that's doing it. Is that just rationalization, or is there some legitimacy to that?
I might say the answer to that is maybe. My favorite answer to virtually every ethical dilemma is it depends. I would argue that yes, when we go to work for somebody, we agree to their rules. That there is an HR manual that we agree to and say that we will comply with that. But what if the rules change while you are employed and you did not agree to those? And, you know, the difference between a tough decision and an ethical dilemma is generally somebody is going to get hurt. And it may be ourselves. So in a dilemma where I have to choose, do I do what I am legally obligated to do as the clerk, or do I follow my values? In either option, the clerk is being hurt. Either they're not being authentic to their values, or they might lose their job. So that's what makes ethics so interesting, is that there is never an easy answer to it. And, you know, at what point in time do we say that an organization, whether it's a government or a company, when do they have the right to impose their rules? And when do they have the right to change them on you?
There's a very poignant Japanese short story called Patriotism, where a captain in the army is ordered to apprehend some of his comrades who have done something they weren't supposed to do. And he is torn between his loyalty to his comrades and his loyalty to his superiors. And he chooses to commit harakiri, because he doesn't see, you know, there's the philosophy of, you know, divided loyalties. He can't choose one over the other, and there's no way out. I don't recommend that we adopt that particular method of resolving these types of things, but you know, I would feel, I think, if I were in a situation where I couldn't discharge my duties without believing that I was violating my core values, you know, the way that court justices recuse themselves from certain cases, if that's an option, and if it's not an option, I may have to resign that job.
So I had a friend of mine in HR that was given the task of enforcing the rules related to the amount of time off that somebody was taking. And absolutely, the employee had violated the timing, the notice, etc. That was just black and white. Yes, they should be fired. Until she had a conversation with them and asked what's going on. They had a child who was in ICU, and it was several months of day to day. You know, you get a phone call, the hospital is calling to say, get down here because we don't know if your child is going to survive until you get here. You would think that that's perfectly reasonable justification for why you're not giving notice and you're just walking away from your desk and running to your car as fast as you can. But when you're an employee of a large multinational organization, they don't look at justification. They look at rules. And so she was faced with this: do I believe in taking care of the employee as is the, you know, part of the role of HR, or do I believe in compliance?
Well, I would say the compliance is, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Stewart.
I was going to say the compliance is taking care of the employee. That's the compliance piece. I mean, by definition, as a human resources leader, you should, part of your compliance role is to take care of the employee. If the employee, because here's the real thing I thought of as you told the story. What's that company like that employee did not have the ability to step forward to somebody in their leadership chain and say, this is what's happening in my life, and I don't have, and this is what I need to do. The only time anybody found out is until the HR person got involved and started asking questions. So, culturally, there's an issue with that company. But, I've been in HR before, I've had that role, and your first obligation is, some people are going to say to the company, some people are going to say to the employee, but by definition, it's human resources. That individual is a human resource, and you have an obligation to at least understand what's going on there and then advocate for that person if it's in line with what we believe is the company should do, my opinion.
And Jonathan, doesn't that go back to the very beginning and invite your question about conscience?
Well, yeah, but the way Stewart's framing it, I think, is beautiful, because the way you were interpreting, I think, Jennifer, was that the compliance was, this is the rule for being at work. And Stewart's demonstrating there is another element of compliance on the other side. So now that we have competing values or principles of compliance, that's where real leadership comes in. How to prioritize. Because you could defend either decision, but I think from our point of view, looking in, I think we would all agree that it's clearly tilted in one direction, that if there's no humanity in an organization, that it's not going to be a healthy environment. It's ultimately not going to be successful.
And that's sometimes with organizations, if you look at them, many organizations on their website will have a list of values. And when you look at them, some of them could actually be conflicting. And which takes priority? So do we understand, I like to call it an even over exercise, is that, I guess Richard Branson might say that taking care of your employees is even more important over caring for your customer. Because he always says that it's not the customer that's number one, it's the employee.
Because if you take care of the employees, they will take care of the customer.
Bingo.
Right. Exactly.
It's cause and effect.
Determine which, so your point and Stewart's point is, if you have two different perspectives on compliance, which takes priority and how do you decide?
Yeah, and that may vary from one situation to the next.
And I also think, especially
Yep.
in large, I'm going to say stratified bureaucratic organizations, there will very likely be more than one set of rules. And some people will have considerably more latitude than others to do particular things. I want to acknowledge, Stewart, the way you articulated the phrase human resources. That really struck me, because I've never worked in HR, but the way you articulated that made me very sensitive to what it should mean, and that people are indeed resources.
I just think that nowadays we don't give the real reason why an organization exists is it's because of the people. And when we write rules, there's a lot of hyperbole out there on, as Jen says, on the webpage about what a company believes in and their values. A lot of it is just words. It's bar talk. Do you live up to it? And companies have this leverage. Once again, does a person want to keep their job or not? And that's the leverage that they have. And I've had roles where I've been a president, and you have ultimate responsibility. And one of the things that I always felt was, if I was in that person's shoes, what decisions would I make? And regardless of what it was, unless somebody got caught stealing, I'm always going to fall down on the side of the teammate and what they're doing. I worked for a company once where, a group of us were part of a decision-making accident board. And I was told at one point, no matter what, the driver's always going to be found guilty. Well, I couldn't live with that. Because why do we have this sham court then saying the driver's always going to be found guilty? This person has a family to take care of. They have a profession. We have to be better than that. So I wasn't very survivable much after that, but I made the conscious decision that, listen, at the end of the day, when you're 100 years old and you're laying in your deathbed and you're doing a retrospective of your life, each of us is going to say, in these circumstances, how could I have been better? And that's what I want you to take away from this. How could I have been better if I had a chance to do it over again? So when we look at legislation about slavery or legislation about gay rights or legislation about guns, the people that wrote it, they didn't know what it was going to look like 100 years from now. They what-ifed it the best way they could. They said, what if this, what if this, what if this? And then after that, it's those of us that have to execute it. We have to be able to modify it to meet the times.
That recalls for me the point Jennifer made about why we have courts. It needs to be subject to interpretation because things do change, people do change, consciousness evolves, etc. I would love to apply that thinking, Jennifer. I don't want to get myself in trouble here. I would love to apply that thinking to science. The notion of settled science just makes my head spin.
That's a topic for another day, man.
Yeah.
Jennifer, you have a final thought?
Yeah, it's I don't know. This has been a very gnarly topic, Jonathan, with lots of different elements to it. And I think for me, at the end of the day, it comes down to, if we go back to the original question about the Dred Scott decision, can I sleep with myself at night based on what I chose to do? And I think all of us at some time or another, Stewart, you mentioned that the easy way of explaining that we are all unethical at times, which is when we get behind a wheel. And if you ask most people, are you a law-abiding citizen? The answer is yes. Until you ask them about the last time they got behind the wheel. Were you paying attention to the speed limits? So, the laws can be guardrails for us to try and keep us within a certain lane. But sometimes when the world changes, we need to change with it. And sometimes it does take somebody standing up and saying, I don't agree with this. And then we all start to think about it maybe just a little bit differently.
Yeah, and the point you made earlier, Jennifer, about competing values, you said sometimes, I would say inevitably. I was just thinking that the sages teach that there are three things on which the world endures: justice, truth, and peace. And if you try to break that down, what is justice? You're choosing right and wrong. You're binary. And truth is not binary. There are all kinds of shades and angles and facets. So you try to get as close as you can by prioritizing which values take precedent in a particular situation. And what is peace? Right? Peace is essentially compromise, which means you're sacrificing an element of truth, an element of justice. So by definition, the most godly qualities that the sages recognized as the foundation of human existence they're only absolutes in a metaphysical sense. Looking down from heaven, everything fits together. But in our messy world, where things are hazy and cloudy and gray, we have to grapple with those ambiguities. And it's the sincere intent that I think is really what makes the difference. Really doing our best to decide not what is going to make me feel good or what's going to serve my purpose, or even, Stewart, what's going to save my job. But rather, what ultimately is most aligned with the most harmonious arrangement of values. And that conversation can go on and on and on, but not now. So thank you for your willingness to tackle this particular topic, which I think would have scared off lesser folks.
I just want to say with Jennifer, this needs doing again.
Yeah, well, we can certainly circle back to it. So thank you, Jennifer Elder, Mark O'Brien, Stewart Wiggins, and to those of you who are watching or listening. If you have a topic you'd like us to take up, please go to my website, ethicsninja.com. Use the contact information, submit your idea if it's compelling. We will address it on a future episode. And as always, I urge you to continue grappling with the gray.